I am Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Over decades of observing patients, analyzing brain images, and following stories of silent suffering and emotional repetition, I've learned that what people believe they feel is, most of the time, not what is really happening inside them. Today I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, almost a common piece of advice, repeated in books, videos, and catchy phrases. The idea of not letting oneself be emotionally affected. At first glance, this sounds like strength, control, maturity, an almost stoic ideal of emotional stability. Many people believe that not being shaken means being strong, evolved, rational. Others imagine it's just about learning to ignore, to let things go, to harden one's mind against the world. But what is rarely said, and what neuroscience reveals in an uncomfortable way, is that this popular notion hides a fundamental error about how the brain works. The human brain was not designed for not feeling. It was shaped for interpreting threat, bonding, and belonging as conditions for survival. And that's exactly where the conflict begins. Because what we call being emotionally affected is not a character flaw nor a psychological weakness. It is the direct result of ancient, deeply ingrained neurological circuits that operate below conscious awareness and continue to function even when we believe we are in control. The problem is not in feeling. The problem lies in not understanding why we feel nor how these mechanisms come to govern our decisions, relationships, and suffering without us even realizing it. And that's what we're going to start taking apart now. Most people believe they feel something because something happened, someone said something, someone walked away, something went wrong, something was lost. This explanation seems logical, comfortable, linear. But she ignores the main point. The brain doesn't react to facts. It reacts to the interpretations it constructs about them. Between the event and the emotion, there is an invisible, rapid, and automatic process, driven by brain structures that do not ask permission from reason. The amygdala, in the limbic system, the threat and reward circuits kick in even before the rational cortex can formulate a conscious thought. When someone says, "That affected me," what really happened was this. The brain interpreted that stimulus as a risk to emotional security, belonging, or identity. And this interpretation is rarely conscious. The most common mistake people make is believing that being emotionally affected is a choice, that all it would take is to have more control, think positively, or be stronger. But the brain doesn't work that way. It works by association. If at any point in life rejection meant pain, abandonment, or humiliation, the brain registers this pattern as a threat. Years later, even in neutral situations, it reacts as if it were defending itself from something real. Not because the person is weak, but that's because the brain learned to survive that way. This is where the first major contradiction arises. The more someone tries not feeling, the more you see it, the more the brain understands that there is something dangerous there. The effort to control the system becomes a warning sign, and the nervous system, upon perceiving this effort, intensifies vigilance, amplifies anxiety, and increases emotional sensitivity. The person believes they are trying to protect themselves, but in practice, they are training their brain to react with even more force. That's why so many people say, "I didn't want to care, but I did. I knew I shouldn't react, but I did. I promised I wouldn't feel this way anymore." The brain doesn't respond to promises, it responds to patterns. And unless the emotional pattern is understood at its root, any attempt to control it will only be a superficial layer over a much deeper system. Society, however, reinforces the opposite illusion. She teaches that emotional maturity is synonymous with coldness, that emotional independence is the absence of impact. Feeling too much is a sign of weakness. But this narrative ignores something essential. No one is immune to being affected. They just learn to mask the signs. And what is not expressed accumulates. It turns into chronic tension, into silent irritability, emotional detachment, superficial relationships, a persistent weariness. The question that almost no one asks is the most important one. If the brain is designed to react emotionally, What does it really mean to train it to not be affected? And even more, is it possible to do this without becoming emotionally numb or disconnected from oneself? This is precisely where most explanations fail. And this is where the analysis needs to go deeper. In the next chapter, we'll delve into the most overlooked mechanism of all, how the brain confuses attachment with survival, and how this transforms ordinary relationships into constant sources of silent suffering. To understand why certain situations affect us so intensely, we need to abandon a comfortable idea that our emotional bonds are, in essence, conscious choices. They are not. The human brain was shaped in a context where being alone meant dying. For thousands of years, exclusion from the group was equivalent to the loss of protection, food, and shelter. This evolutionary memory has not disappeared. It has only been refined, hidden beneath layers of language, culture, and rationality. Today, when someone distances themselves, criticizes, ignores, or withdraws affection, the brain doesn't interpret it as a common social event. It interprets it as threat to emotional survival. And what's most disturbing is that it reacts before the person even realizes it. Activation occurs in deep regions, primarily in the amygdala and limbic system, areas responsible for detecting danger. The body responds with muscle tension, increased heart rate, and altered breathing. Thought comes later, attempting to justify what the body has already decided to feel. That's why many people say, "I know I shouldn't care, but something inside me reacts." This something is not a weakness. It's an alarm system. The problem begins when the brain starts to associate emotional attachment with security. At this point, the bond ceases to be a conscious choice and becomes a silent need. The person no longer seeks the other for affection, but for emotional regulation. They don't just want to be together, they need to be. And the greater the need, the greater the fear of loss. This is the central paradox. The more someone tries to protect themselves from suffering, the more dependent they become on that which can cause it. The brain learns through repetition that certain stimuli momentarily relieve anxiety. Attention, messages, validation, presence, immediate response. Each small confirmation releases dopamine, a brief relief, a sign of safety. But dopamine doesn't teach stability. It teaches search. Over time, the brain begins to demand increasingly larger doses of the same stimulus to feel the same level of comfort. And when it doesn't come, the system interprets it as a threat. This is where disproportionate reactions arise. Anxiety without a clear reason, feeling rejected even without evidence, repetitive thoughts, need for control, intense fear of losing people, difficulty tolerating silence or distance. The person believes they are suffering because of love, but in reality, they are reacting to an overactive neurological circuit. And here emerges an uncomfortable truth. The brain does not distinguish between love and emotional dependence when it is operating in survival mode. Both activate the same areas, both produce attachment, both generate fear of loss. That's why so many relationships are mistaken for destiny, deep connection, or emotional intensity, when in reality they are just nervous systems trying to regulate themselves through each other. Society romanticizes this flame of passion. It's called a strong bond, it's called feeling too much. But from a neurological point of view, this is a brain that has not yet learned to maintain internal stability without external support. And here arises a question that almost no one dares to ask. If my equilibrium depends on the other person's reaction, who is really in control? Most people believe that being emotionally affected is a sign of sensitivity, but in practice, it is often a sign of conditioning. Over the years, the brain has been trained to associate self-worth with the responses of others, and anything that threatens this response activates fear, anxiety, and emotional pain. The question is not how not to feel. The question is, why did the brain learn to feel this way? In the next chapter, we'll get to the most uncomfortable point of all, because trying to be emotionally strong often produces the exact opposite: more fragility, more tension, and more internal dependence. And why most people never realize this: there is a deeply ingrained idea in modern culture that being emotionally strong means not being shaken, not reacting, not showing vulnerability. This idea seems logical, but from a neurological point of view, it's a dangerous misconception. The brain doesn't interpret repression as force, it interprets it as unresolved threat. When an emotion arises and is immediately suppressed without being understood, processed, or integrated, the nervous system does not understand that the problem has been solved. It understands that the danger is still present, only silenced. This is where the accumulation begins. The body holds on to what the conscious mind tries to ignore. Unexpressed tension turns into muscle stiffness. Unacknowledged anger becomes constant irritability. Unprocessed fear turns into diffuse anxiety. Repressed sadness turns into apathy. The person believes they are holding on, but in practice they are teaching their brain to live in a state of permanent alert. That's the paradox. The more someone tries to be emotionally impenetrable, the more sensitive their nervous system becomes. Because the brain understands that if emotions are too dangerous to be felt, then the world needs to be monitored even more carefully. This is how emotional hypervigilance is born. The person starts analyzing everything: the tone of voice, silence, the delay in responding, the look in his eyes that seems different. Nothing goes unnoticed because the brain is constantly looking for signs of threat, and that's exhausting. Over time, this constant vigilance creates a diffuse feeling of mental fatigue, an emotional exhaustion that is not resolved by physical rest. The body may sleep, but the nervous system remains active. The individual doesn't understand why. He believes he is being strong, that he is coping well, that has already overcome certain things. But the body tells a different story. Neuroscience shows that unprocessed emotions don't disappear. They change form, they migrate, they infiltrate thoughts, automatic reactions, and relationship patterns. That's why people who consider themselves cold often react intensely to minor frustrations. They either shut down completely when they feel they are losing control, or they emotionally distance themselves from anything that could generate real involvement. It's not coldness, it's learned self-protection. And all excessive protection comes at a price. The most silent of these is the loss of emotional spontaneity. The person ceases to feel complete joy, genuine connection, real enthusiasm. Everything goes through a filter of control. It becomes functional but disconnected. This state is often confused with maturity. But emotional maturity is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to navigate emotion without being overwhelmed by it. And that requires something that almost no one learns: the difference between feeling and identifying with what one feels. Most people don't say, "I am feeling afraid." They say, "I am afraid." They don't say, "I feel insecure." They say, "I am insecure." This small linguistic detail reveals something profound: the fusion between identity and emotion. When this happens, any emotion comes to define who the person is. And at that point, losing emotional control seems equivalent to losing one's own identity. That's why so many people fight against what they feel instead of understanding it. But the brain doesn't learn through struggle, it learns through recognition. As long as emotion is treated as an enemy, it grows stronger. When it is understood as a signal, it loses its power to dominate. And here, an inevitable question arises. If trying to control emotions makes the problem worse, then what does it really mean to train the brain not to be affected? The answer is not in hardening. It lies in the reorganization of the circuits that associate emotion with threat. And that is precisely what we will begin to examine in the next chapter. How can the brain be reprogrammed to feel without collapsing, react without losing its balance, and relate without becoming emotionally imprisoned? When people talk about training the brain, most imagine something like willpower, mental discipline, or positive thinking. But this idea, while popular, is superficial. The brain does not learn through rational command. He learns by repeated exposure, emotional association, and predictability. This means that no profound change happens simply because someone decides not to be shaken anymore. Real change occurs when the nervous system realizes, over time, that certain experiences no longer pose a threat. And this perception is not intellectual, it's physiological. The brain needs to feel safe, not just understanding the concept of security. Here's a crucial point that's almost never explained. Emotions are not the problem. The problem is the body's automatic reaction to them. When an emotion arises, fear, sadness, rejection, frustration, the body reacts before the mind. The heart races, breathing changes, muscles contract. This happens in fractions of a second without conscious awareness. Most people try to interrupt this process with their thoughts, but the brain doesn't respond to arguments when it's in a state of alert. It responds to signals of physiological stability. This is why so many attempts to rationalize emotions fail. You can perfectly understand why something shouldn't affect you and still feel the impact with the same intensity. Because emotional learning doesn't happen in the rational cortex, it happens in the older layers of the brain. Training the brain, therefore, is not about avoiding feeling, and teaching the nervous system to navigate emotions without interpreting them as danger. And this only happens when three things start to change. 1. The relationship with one's own body. 2. The way the mind interprets internal sensations. 3. The meaning attributed to emotions. Most people completely ignore the body. They live from the head up. But the body is the first to react. It registers everything before the mind. When someone learns to remain present during an emotion, without running away, without suppressing it, without dramatizing it, something new happens. The brain realizes that this activation does not lead to destruction. This experience, repeated over time, reprograms the threat circuits. It's not strength, it's neurological habituation. The same principle explains why fears diminish with gradual exposure. The brain learns, through direct experience, that the stimulus is not fatal. The problem is that most people do the opposite. They avoid, run away, distract, numb themselves. And each time it runs away, the brain learns that there really was something to fear. Another key point: the brain needs emotional coherence. This means that when you feel something but behave as if you don't, an internal conflict is created. The nervous system becomes disorganized. One part reacts, the other tries to control. Over time, this generates feelings of emptiness, disconnection, or existential weariness. It is at this stage that many people say, "I don't feel anything anymore," or "It feels like I'm disconnected." Actually, they're not switched off, they're overloaded. Emotional detachment is a defense mechanism when the brain finds no other way to cope with an excess of unresolved emotional stimuli. And here emerges a truth that is difficult to accept. Emotional indifference is not strength. It's a sign of nervous system exhaustion. Training the brain, therefore, is not about hardening it. It's about teaching the body to tolerate emotions without collapsing or running away. It's about allowing the emotion to arise, be felt, and dissolve, without it defining who you are or what you should do. This takes time. It requires awareness. It requires repetition. And above all, it requires abandoning the fantasy of absolute control. In the next chapter, we will delve into the most delicate point of all: how society silently reinforces emotional disconnection while selling the illusion of autonomy, freedom, and self-sufficiency. It is at this point that many realize they are not just dealing with personal emotions, but with a deep collective conditioning. There is a silent, rarely questioned narrative that runs through modern society. The idea that the individual must be emotionally self-sufficient, strong, independent, and immune. From an early age, we learn that feeling too much is a sign of weakness, that emotional dependence is a sign of immaturity, that demonstrating neediness is something to be corrected. This narrative did not emerge by chance. It is functional. A society that values productivity, performance, and control needs individuals who suppress internal conflicts, who don't stop to feel, who keep functioning despite emotional exhaustion. And the brain, continuously exposed to this model, learns to adapt. But adaptation comes at a cost. Gradually, people stop noticing what they truly feel. They learn to name emotions generically. "I'm tired and I'm stressed," when in reality they are dealing with frustration, fear, loneliness, resentment, or unresolved grief. This emotional numbing is socially rewarded. Those who don't complain are seen as strong. Those who don't show vulnerability are seen as mature. Those who endure everything in silence are admired. The brain registers this as learning, feeling less, belonging more. And once again, the survival system kicks in. A person doesn't stop feeling. It simply shifts the feeling to deeper, less conscious layers. This is why many develop diffuse symptoms, anxiety without a clear cause, chronic tension, insomnia, irritability, difficulty relaxing, a constant feeling of emptiness. It's not emotional weakness. It's the body trying to signal something that the mind refuses to listen to. There is a crucial point here. The brain does not differentiate between legitimate emotional pain and socially condemned weakness. It only responds to accumulation. And when he can't find an outlet, he creates escape valves, compulsions, emotional dependencies, a need for control, isolation, hyperproductivity, or apathy. All of these are unconscious attempts at self-regulation. The problem is that the culture calls this personality. It says that someone is cold, strong, independent, and rational. But behind these labels, there is often an exhausted nervous system operating at the limit of emotional tolerance. This is where one of the greatest modern illusions arises, the belief that not needing anyone is a sign of progress. From a neurological point of view, this is false. The human brain is, by nature, relational. It performs better in a secure connection than in isolation. True emotional autonomy is not the absence of attachment. It's the ability to relate without losing oneself. And this requires something that society rarely teaches, the ability to remain present with oneself even when difficult emotions arise. No escape. Without anesthesia, no performance. It is precisely this ability that differentiates someone who reacts from someone who chooses. And here comes the question that concludes this chapter. If we've been conditioned from a young age to avoid emotional discomfort, how do we relearn to cope without collapsing? The answer is not immediate. It demands one last step, perhaps the most difficult of all. That's what we'll talk about in the final chapter. There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when the individual begins to perceive something different in themselves. It's not a grand epiphany. It's not a dramatic change. It's more subtle than that. It's the moment he realizes the emotion has arisen, and yet he has remained whole, without running away, without reacting impulsively, without trying to explain oneself, without judging yourself. This moment is rare and profoundly transformative, because it is at this point that the brain begins to learn something new. Feeling threatened is not the same as being threatened. Most people never consciously experience this. They spend their lives oscillating between two extremes. Either they let their emotions dominate them, or they try to suppress them. But there is a third way, a silent, barely visible path that doesn't generate applause or motivational phrases, but profoundly alters the relationship with one's own mind. This path begins when a person stops fighting against what they feel and starts to observe. Observe without reacting. Observe without identifying yourself. To observe without trying to change anything immediately. From a neurological point of view, this simple gesture produces a powerful effect. It interrupts the automatic cycle between stimulus and response. The brain, accustomed to reacting, finds an empty space, an interval. And it is in this interval that something new takes shape. The amygdala decreases its activation. The prefrontal cortex recovers its function. The nervous system exits, albeit briefly, the threat mode. Not because the emotion disappeared, but because it ceased to be interpreted as danger. This is where many people get confused. They believe that not being affected means not feeling anything. But in reality, it means not being swept away by emotion. The feeling continues to happen. The difference is that now there is interior space, space to understand, space to choose from, space to avoid reacting automatically. This space changes everything. Because when it exists, emotion ceases to define identity. Fear stops being "I am afraid." Sadness ceases to be "I am weak." Anger ceases to be "I lost control." Emotion becomes what it always was, a transient phenomenon. But here's the hardest part to accept. This state is not achieved through willpower. It is built through repeated presence, and it requires tolerating discomfort without running away from it. There are no shortcuts. The brain only learns that it is safe when it experiences the feeling of remaining whole in the face of what previously seemed unbearable. And that takes time. It takes silence. It takes inner honesty. It takes courage not to become numb. That's why so few people make it this far. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires abandoning an identity based on reaction. When this starts to happen, something changes profoundly. The words of others automatically lose their power to hurt. Rejection ceases to be an existential threat. Silence is no longer interpreted as abandonment. Loneliness ceases to be a constant enemy, not because the person became cold, but because they became entire. And perhaps the most unsettling conclusion of all is this: what affects us most emotionally is not other people. It's the relationship we learn to have with our own reactions. As long as this relationship is one of fear, control, and denial, the suffering repeats itself. When it becomes one of observation, acceptance, and awareness, something reorganizes itself. And then, for the first time, the brain learns that feeling is not a problem. The problem has always been not knowing what to do with what one feels. And this understanding, silent, gradual, profound, is the true beginning of emotional freedom.